Anyways, good Sunday morning to all of my viewers out there. Perhaps you can see in the background there's a barn over there in the distance. I'm carrying a bag of 2 books. Today I'm going to be doing my book reading from a community library that it's a private library, and I'll take some pictures of the signage. So let's go to this library. Now the people who own this house up ahead and the barn has been converted into a library. From what I understand, they're both engineers. They have a love for reading, and they've collected and accumulated a lot of books, and then they've inspired other people to drop off their books here. And so now you have a library. We'll be there shortly in a minute, and I'm going to donate one of my books to this library. Oh, and in case you're wondering, I'm in Saint Armand, Quebec, about 5-6 miles from the Vermont border. As you can see, there's the sign. We're coming into the driveway. And we're being greeted by a very friendly dog. Or a couple of dogs. Hey, killers! As you can see, vineyards. This is wine country. There are a lot of people making wine around here. Well, here's the entrance to the library. So let's go inside. All right, let's throw on some lights. It's quite the collection of books, not to mention artwork. But if you come to read here, better bring a jacket. All right, well, happy Thanksgiving weekend. I just met the owners of this beautiful book barn, Lucy, and I haven't met her husband, Reno. But anyways, we had to talk. I gave her, presented to her my book, and she was very appreciative. And so, again, welcome to ABAJAM Chronicles, 2 families lost in time, reading, excuse me, from chapter 18, Mere Coincidence or Divine Providence. Now, before we begin with chapter 18, of course, I have to recap from last week. So, here we go. Wow, talk about deja vu all over again. My next chapter will elaborate on that period when I returned home and the Thanksgiving dinner we celebrated with the Vaniers that October. Come to think of it, I'm beginning to recall it was also during that period I stumbled on the extraordinary latent powers of the modules. Inadvertently, of course. Oh my God, now I remember it was in the garage at home before we went to the Vaniers. That's where it all began. That's how we got here. Computer off. Okay. Which computer am I on now? And this is where Albert was drifting back and forth from his home in Kitchener. He had a personal computer on a desk in his bedroom, as opposed to having an appropriate den in his house now in the Simcoe, Port Ryerson area. So now we're reading from chapter 18, Mere Coincidence or Divine Providence. Excuse me. I pushed myself away from my desk and the computer I was actually on. My computer back then in Kitchener, in our bedroom, didn't have voice control or command recognition. I leaned way back, resting the chairs high back against the wall, and blankly stared at the flat black screen for quite some time. Had anyone walked in on me at that moment, they would have mistaken my composure as one of repose or deep contemplation. In actuality, I was reeling under the jumble of thoughts, disoriented images of people and aliens and visions so fantastic they were indecipherable. Shutting off my computer just now was probably the best course of action I could have performed. These things, computers, were nefarious devices after all. I've often suggested they were contrivances of the devil. Even still, this whole mental exercise was beginning to tax and overwhelm my little brain when a loud tumult coming from the kitchen upstairs shattered the spell I was under. Whatever was going on upstairs may have just saved my brain from exploding. Well, maybe not literally. But it sure felt like it. For a brief moment, I feared the modules had come back to life, or whatever constituted their existence. Before I had a chance to exit my chair and office, Alison popped her head through the door and announced that the boys and Tanya were back. I was startled and relieved at the same time upon hearing the news and thanked her, indicating I would be upstairs momentarily. I had to regain my composure and collect my thoughts before dealing with whatever news our intrepid sleuths had to offer. I couldn't afford to appear disoriented or overwrought with anxiety in front of my family and the others, especially not before Andrea. She had enough doubt to deal with. I lugged both chairs from the den back upstairs to the kitchen in case they'd be needed. They weren't. Everyone except for Andrea and Frank were gathered in the kitchen. 7 were already seated around the large oval dinner table while Jason, Steve, and Tanya were going to remain standing. My appearance has, the old man out, made that a total of 11. I didn't count our 2 dogs or the cats or as candidates, even though they too joined us. The kitchen was much warmer than normal due to the presence of so many bodies and the fact that Bernie was using the wood-burning kitchen range to heat up water for tea or coffee. With limited resources and no knowledge of when we might expect to replenish them, if ever, having the addition of an antique wood gas stove, antique model gas and wood stove in the kitchen now proved somewhat foresighted on our part. Bernie and I were actually ridiculed not too long ago about being too extravagant or nonsensical in some of our selections and penchant for rustic collectibles. Excuse me for a second. Come on in, it's okay. I'm just doing a private reading for YouTube. Like my hobby for collecting antique or replica clocks, barometers, and historical implements, or Bernie's obsession with ornamental kerosene lamps and utensils. Our peculiar curiosities may yet prove to be our salvation. The wood stove has so far. There's nothing like the sweet aroma of burning wood filling a room to put everyone temporarily at ease. Fireplaces and stoves have that effect on people. There's much good to be said about old world traditions and their charms. Even though our kitchen had modern appliances, people are more inclined to gather around a practical gas or a wood stove than a microwave oven. Unless, of course, they're eating in some unadorned, bland lunchroom at some factory. And so here we were all gathered, waiting for the news that Jason, Steve, and Tanya were about to make known to us. Jason had retrieved his laptop and had connected the camera to it to download the pictures he had taken. Tanya, in turn, spread out on the table a local regional road map. All the roads might be gone, but the lay of the land and shoreline remained somewhat familiar. For the next hour, our 3 intrepid adventurers recounted their trek to the Indian village, situated approximately 4 miles from our location. In the course of their travels, they encountered no one that they were aware of, but they had also made sure to avoid any well-worn path or track. That's why they took so long. They were slogging through untraveled, unbroken bush. They also had to cut a wide detour around a huge swath of open land, probably cleared for crops. The 3 sisters, Bill suggested, then informing us that corn, squash, and beans was the food of all Indian around here. My grandmère, she tell me this. That would also explain their disheveled, dusty appearance and matted hair, especially Tanya's, although she seemed unconcerned about it. Their soiled, scruffy trousers and dirt and sweat-streaked face. Obviously, they hadn't had the opportunity to wash up yet. Tanya became the unofficial spokesperson for the 3 of them. She expressed appreciation to me on behalf of all of them for not only the weapons but also for my binoculars and powerful camera. These tools had enabled them to remain well out of range and sight while still being able to gather useful information or surveillance material. Excuse me. Many of the pictures and some of the video footage we all watched on the laptop screen were taken from high vantage point. For those pictures, Jason had to climb considerably high up a tree, but the shots were well worth the effort. It was necessary for him to do so in order to see beyond the wooded palisade walls and into the village. According to what he was able to see and record digitally, the village consisted of at least 24 oblong-shaped longhouses, each one approximately 75 to 100 feet long, just as we had seen from the air a few days earlier, but at an altitude of over 9,000 feet ASL, which is above sea level. There, up close and personal observations would provide us more accurate details. Jason described the structures as being crude, wooden bark shingled dwellings with up to half a dozen chimney holes spaced evenly apart across the top of the roofs. The palisade walls interlaced on sharp counter angles to each. The palisade walls were made up of hundreds of 10 or 12 foot long tree poles interlaced on sharp angles to each other. The walls were built just beyond the creek's elevated embankment along the eastern side, with its main entrance actually facing Young's Creek. The small entrance allowed only a couple of people access at a time. Once inside, all people traffic was confined between two palisade walls, much like a livestock chute would restrict the movement of animals to one behind the other in single file. That description made me recall an old limerick I was taught in grade school for traffic safety that went, single file, Indian style, facing traffic all the while. Not exactly politically correct nowadays. Tanya interjected here that any would-be attacker would be forced to run that long, narrow gauntlet before having access to their open compound. Jason continued by exclaiming he observed numerous women and children going in and out regularly to fetch water. Both he and Tanya, she was watching from below through a large stand of willow brushes, estimated up towards 700 to 800 people possibly lived in that village. It was hard to accurately determine because of all the comings and goings of the occupants. Still, we all felt a little uncomfortable at the revelation of there being that many Indians in such close proximity to us, and not knowing whether they were hostile, friendly, or indifferent to our presence. Steve added that along the banks of Young's Creek were over a dozen what appeared to be canoes, but not the birch bark kind he was familiar with from up north. These were more like hollowed-out trees called dugout canoes. Some could carry 5 or 6 occupants, while a couple of the larger ones could easily accommodate 12 to 15 persons. Those, he commented, would be more suitable for long-distance lake travel. Steve did know his canoes, having built a bark canoe at a Pathfinder camp when he was younger, something Bill had told me recently. It was at this point that Tanya suggested we might be wise to look to our own defenses and perhaps erect our own fortified palisade wall around the compound. Steve cautioned against anyone prematurely worrying, as there was nothing to suggest these Indians were hostile. It would still be prudent to prepare in case our neighbors proved to be unfriendly, Tanya reiterated. Oh, and one other rather alarming piece of information we almost forgot to tell everyone here, she announced, glancing over at the boys as their cue. Steve took the lead. In our traveling off the beaten path to scout out the village, we came upon an inordinate number of snakes slithering in the grass, hiding in the brush, and numerous snakes lying on exposed rocks warming themselves. All 3 women, Bernie, Jackie, and Allison, but excluding Tanya, ewed in unison with disgust, each showing their aversion and displeasure to that particular announcement. Sorry, Mom, ladies, there's worse news, Steve continued with an expression of concern on his face. Most of the snakes we encountered were rattlesnakes. Mind you, they were as diligent in avoiding us as we were of them, but none of us have ever seen or encountered that many snakes, let alone rattlers, and big ones at that, in our whole lives, and all in one day. This was another reason we traveled so slow. This is right, Bill exuberantly exclaimed, as if he had just came upon a revelation. Me grand-mère tell me how the land in some area was covered with many snakes back in the old days. She tell me sometimes her papa, they take torch like fire branch to chase away snakes from property and garden. Sometimes this cause unwanted fires. This is good information to know. Anyone must be careful, comprenez-vous? He looked directly at Ryan when he made that announcement. Tanya piped up again and answered, You've all been warned. Now what about our fortress and shoring up security? Before anyone else could speak up, Allison interrupted the proceedings. Let's not forget about Sheba and Samson and the dogs. They're not familiar with rattlesnakes. What are we going to do if they get bitten? We could all see by her expression the very real anxiety she felt concerning our pets. That's all I needed. Another daughter to hate me if her cat got killed. not to mention how the others might feel if Cadfield or Barclay should meet the same fate. At the moment, nothing, Tanya suggested with just a hint of indifference. The sooner we get the compound fortified and enclosed, the fewer incidents or possibility of snakes and all kinds of snakes of all kinds getting your pets. She was obviously not a cat or dog person. Bill jumped right back in at that moment and volunteered to begin construction of the fortress. It would keep Allison's cat safe and him from getting bored, what with all the idle time on his hands and not being able to sleep regularly. He immediately asked for assistance, openly suggesting Thomas, the boys, and even me, if I could pull myself away from my book writing. Even Allison would be welcome to help out. Bill, I sincerely would love to help you, I excluded myself, but just before the boys and Tanya got back, I had an insightful revelation that got interrupted. Fortunately, I thought to myself, and if I can re-establish the connections, I might have an answer as to how we got here, maybe even the whys. The getting back will be a different matter, but it's a start. Needless to say, that remark elicited everyone's attention, followed by an immediate barrage of questions. Again, I had to apologize, explaining that I had been interrupted by the arrival of Jason, Steve, and Tanya, exactly at that crucial moment of epiphany. So for the next day or two, I was going to focus my attention and all my efforts on discovering that answer. I will also require everyone's cooperation in this venture if I'm going to be successful. That means I may require the attendance of some of you from time to time. The more of this puzzle I can piece together, the sooner we'll have some definite answers. But do start on the walls. I seriously believe that building them would be advantageous to our situation, not to mention occupy our time more productively. Glancing over at Allison, I added, keeping us and our pets safer. Making that last exclamation as I did almost put an imperative to the issue of building the wall. I'm beginning to think everyone here suspected I'm rather clairvoyant or have some unnaturally prescient abilities. I was just being prudent, just like Tanya suggested. I knew as much about the future as they did. Well, perhaps a little more. There were some incidents in the past, like me winning the lottery, the plane crash, Sean's betrayal, and the event that put Frank into his coma. But what happens next is still a mystery to me. Yes, I think that's what I'm going to work on next in my chronicles. I'll only need Steve for that. I can always get back to Jackie, maybe even Bill if he doesn't get too busy later on. I was also thinking, what with this newfound ability of actual mind melding, I just might enlist the assistance of Tanya. She might have information that was pertinent to our circumstances that she was unaware of. It was getting late in the day, and Bill realized he wasn't going to get much accomplished, so he consented to letting me have his son for a few more hours. Working through the night wasn't an option because we really didn't have excess electricity to run the lights continuously. Any usage of lights had to be localized and minimized. I reminded Bill and the others that my diesel fuel, though plentiful under normal circumstances, was sorely limited now. Out of habit, I had all my tanks topped up before the long weekend arrived. There is nothing more annoying than having to get fuel, whether propane or gasoline or even diesel for that matter, on a long weekend and pay the ritual long weekend price gouging. I might be rich, but I wasn't stupid. That meant that if my hobby, John Deere tractor, was going to be utilized, every minute that engine was running had to be used productively. No unnecessary idling. That also meant all activities and details had to be planned in advance. The same went for using the chainsaws and all the equipment in my workshop. We are now in a brave new world, I reminded everyone, and that means a serious paradigm shift away from our wasteful mindset, of which I'm the guiltiest, I readily admit. Money will do that to you. I also consented to allowing Jason and Tanya, and of course Steve, after our session together, to hang on to their weapons, just in case. With nothing left to discuss, the family meeting was adjourned. We all agreed, as we dispersed, to be especially watchful for snakes in the grass. I jokingly suggested that the next time Jason climbs into the sea wind, he should make sure there are no snakes on the plane. Ha ha ha. Bernie offered to prepare a light supper for everyone who was hungry, but no one seemed interested in eating at the moment. Just like this place's effect on our circadian rhythms and our inability to sleep regularly, it also had an effect on our body's metabolism so that we now rarely found ourselves hungry. Considering our limited food supplies, this could prove to be advantageous, assuming there's no, as of yet, undetermined negative debilitating side effects. So many variables and unknowns. The sooner I can come up with some definitive answers, hopefully the better we can deal with our current state of affairs. Steve and I each carried a spare chair back downstairs to my den. We also took a beer along. Not for the alcohol. There would be little to no effect in that regard. It was more for the symbolism of camaraderie. Just a couple of dudes discussing shop over a beer. Besides, any excuse for having a beer works for me, especially if it's one of my stronger homemade porters. Before we began, I recounted to Steve the circumstances of my last personal session and the overwhelming effect it almost had on me. I suggested to him he should resist getting too caught up in my altered state of consciousness, not just for his sake, but that for mine as well. I then confessed to him I actually didn't require his input immediately, as I had to first revisit that episode where I concluded my own experiment on the modules shortly after getting home from our trip and the visit with him and his family later that October. I'm extremely leery about going back on my own considering what happened. That's why you're here. You are more removed from that night's experimentation and the initial reaction I created than Jason would be. As an additional safety precaution, I assured him, as well as energy conservation, I've switched over to my laptop instead of using my desktop PC. Everything I've recorded so far is stored on the spare MSD memory stick as well. I figure, what with my laptop's programmed to back up every 30 seconds, I won't lose much data should you and I get too caught up in a trance. And the batteries start to die in a couple of hours, forcing the session to terminate. At least, that's the plan. After all that's happened, Mr. Meisner, and seeing all those Indians in that big village not so far from here, anything you can do to explain and help us understand it, I'm all for. I'm not that 14-year-old anymore. I'm more than old enough to take responsibility for everything that's happened. Me and Jason already discussed it, and we both feel as much at fault as you probably do. There is one question that's really troubling me, though. It might sound crazy, but you're familiar with my family's religious background. Considering everything that's happened to us these past 12 years, us being here for one, your preparedness for our circumstances and all those other numerous coincidences, do you suppose God might have had anything to do with any of the events that happened to us? Your question is no crazier than my dad thinking, thanks to your dad, by the way, that this place is purgatory. We both simultaneously broke out into riotous laughter at the ridiculous notion. No, Steve, the fact that we're here and we're all still alive neither confirms nor disqualifies God's intervention in all these events. Having foreknowledge of future events doesn't necessarily ordain me as some sort of a prophet. Prophetic predictions usually come with an appendage of conditions and caveats. Example, such and such will happen at some future point in time unless so-and-so does this or that now. If I were a prophet or clairvoyant and knew the answer to your question, it wouldn't be necessary to take these little excursions down memory lane trying to understand our predicament. I'm just thinking, if God were responsible, there's not much any of us could have done to prevent anything that's happened, Steve suggested. Well, Steve, really smart aliens with super sophisticated technology could have manipulated most of the events, including my thoughts, just as effectively as God might have. This problem goes well beyond any simple theological answer. I let him know I appreciated his candor as well as confidence in me, then took a good slug of beer before proceeding to initialize my laptop. Almost as quickly as it whirled to life and found the program files, I found myself back at home for a third time, along in my garage, staring down at my recent two unique and unusual acquisitions, and no one was around to disturb me. Well, that concludes this week's reading of ABAJAM Chronicles. Next week, I'll be reading The Ruse and the Experiment, Chapter 18. I hope all of you have enjoyed it, and I'm hoping that all of you will have enjoyed this Thanksgiving weekend. Until then, catch you later.